Great. So goals for this session. Trying to speed run through this, but we're going to recap impact evaluation, retroactive funding, and how that links to some of the broader public goods ecosystem concepts that we talked about. Second, we're also going to present a framework for impact evaluation design and operation. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of 100 ways to do an impact evaluator the wrong way that we've learned in protocol labs. And then I'd like to open this up. I think there's some existential problems that we could really use the community and a bunch of diverse opinions to help solve. So, what is an impact evaluator? It's retroactive public good funding. It's impact evaluator. Essentially, it is a mechanism that funds projects based off outcomes that have been achieved versus expected outcomes. So this is typically attributed to Optimism, who pioneered it with the retro PGF experiment. A lot of others have done this in different formats. Right now, I'd say where we're at is like we have a good starting point in terms of theory, base experiments, but really I think there's a lot of problem space to cover when it comes to how this actually manifests in the design, implementation, and iteration of impact evaluators, which is what we've been trying to do at Protocol Labs. So there's some great reference material out there by Carl from Optimism, our very own Juan and Evan have given some good general overviews here. So I encourage everybody to check that out. So I'll start with what problems do impact evaluators actually solve? And I think there's this, this common mantra of, well, we want to make sure that people get rewarded for the work they do. I'd say I would put two flavors on it. One is it represents a missing component of what's called the market dynamics of a public goods ecosystem. So it's value signaling. Right now, we're seeing a lot of kind of proactive funding through various types of grants, bounties, et cetera, foundation funding. But what we're missing, I would assert, is a very good feedback signal that allows these funding systems to self-adjust and identify if the projects they're funding and the way that they're funding them are actually creating the outcomes that we're desiring. And there's a lot of ways to pick that apart about what is a good outcome, how do we actually evaluate that, and how do we measure that. What we think is that impact feedback and impact evaluators, they add this missing component that allows us to back propagate signal about what is valuable back into a market so people can actually be more efficient in allocating the capital in the projects that they choose. The second part is when we think of it from like an incentive design perspective, there's a bit of a gap right now in public goods that we see, I don't want to over financialize, but the analog would be something like VC. And this is idea that the funding system profile, the risk and the reward and the uncertainty needs to match the projects that they're trying to fund. And in order for us to see those really kind of high uncertainty, high upside problems emerge in public goods, we need large scale, high uncertainty type funding mechanisms to support them. We think things like impact evaluation are very good, opportunities to do that. And impact evaluators link to this broader, refi strategy that we've talked about. Impact evaluation, which Holka and Kevin talked about earlier, is a component of this hypersearch ecosystem, and it's another kind of transaction within that ecosystem that we need to enable to actually support this kind of broader impact market or market dynamics within public goods. And it's an important part of this kind of composable refi funding ecosystem where you have projects, different types of funders, different types of mechanisms, all working together to solve the best and most effective public goods projects that work towards the outcomes that we want. But impact evaluation is really hard. And a lot of people have tried. We've tried and we've failed to various degrees. But we know that we need to make it more efficient and scalable. I would draw the analog to, we've seen kind of valuation methodology in capital markets finance evolve over hundreds of years. So over that time, new methodologies, new frameworks exist, discounted cash flow, comparables analysis that allowed people to independently and more efficiently create an impact evaluation about how valuable something was, which really shorted the kind of transaction cost that it took for people to understand what is valuable and allocate their funding towards it. What if we had this concerted effort and we accelerated it so we build the methodology, the tooling, the theory to actually lower the transaction cost of an impact evaluator, and what would be the impacts on the public goods ecosystem? I would assert that by lowering the transaction cost of an impact evaluator, we could see a lot more retroactive funding come through, and we could see a lot more efficient work done within the public goods ecosystem. So when we think of this, I think one of the things that we've tried to explore is how do we create a base framework for how you would set up an impact evaluator? I think it's a broad concept, but what are the things that you actually need to consider when you build one out? So I would say there's 4 key things from a design perspective. 1, you need a good reserve asset pool. You need an incentive function. You need contribution tracking. You need value measurement. So reserve asset pool basically means where is the capital that you are going to, or the capital or the reward system, whether that's social credit, that's NFTs, whatever you want, where does that exist, and how do you actually make sure that that is maintained over the life cycle of impact evaluators, especially if an impact evaluator is retroactively planned for 2 to 3 years in the future? How do you maintain that asset pool so you can actually allocate it in the future? Incentive functions. I think this is super interesting because you really have to think of it from what are the outcomes and the signal and the behaviors that I want to incentivize through an impact evaluator, and how do I shape the reward curve to do so? So I can do kind of a reward curve that rewards everybody equally, and you'll kind of get equal outcomes across all the different projects. Or I can do a kind of power law distribution on rewards, and then we start to see the emergence of projects that are going after very high upside type prizes. Think the X Prize, think some of the Fiat Connect work that Merrick was talking about earlier. It's also important that it's positive sum, so that people competing in any of these impact evaluators are actually working together. And an example of that is, the more work that is done against this area, the more reward is released. So think of that as, as we kind of as more people join an open source software project, more rewards are released. So the addition of one more person to this impact evaluation project actually creates more funding. So there's an incentive for people to bring in and work against this. Also, you have to think about in terms of repeated application. So how do we keep on doing this? Because it's going to take time to propagate the signal and create a proper control system dynamic there. Contributions are important. Figuring out what the unit of contribution is that actually coordinates or indicates this impact evaluator is very important. And value measurement is very hard because it's how do we kind of create a function that translates what we think is value in the terms of the impact evaluator to kind of the fiat and the reserve currency. And I think the nuanced part here is how do we design this with an acceptable loss function or a loss coefficient and then adjust? And what I mean by that is any sort of impact evaluator is going to have some people or some entities that will work against the idea, and it's just kind of like the good arts law. If we create any sort of metric, people will game against it, and it's up to us to understand what is the acceptable loss coefficient of bad actors in the system so that we can actually still generate good work. So I'll skip over this really quickly. I think one important thing in the framework that we're looking at is if you're setting up an impact evaluator, it's really what you want to keep free and what do you want to actually have the community or have a system create. So thinking about what are these different degrees of freedom, you can think about what is the scope of the evaluation that we're creating. What are the contributions? What constitutes good work against the outcomes we're looking to create? What is kind of the reward and allocation system? How do we size the amount of reward that an impact evaluator should give out? And then how do we allocate that among the different contributions to an impact evaluator in a way that actually properly rewards and incentivizes people? Now, what we've seen is that these are really hard to do. So you have to constrain some of these and set these centrally so that you can actually operationalize it. You need to focus where there are expert inputs. You need to focus this on very specific steps and constrain the rest. And then finally, there's kind of this concept of you can almost do a top-down where you're setting, we've seen Retro PGF, for example, set a prize pool, and then that prize pool is allocated, the judges vote to actually allocate that prize pool. That's one way of doing it. Or you can think of something that's more akin to a block reward, where you set up the reward function at the basis, and then it just adds up. So every additional unit of work increases the reward. So this is a way that we've thought about, depending on the situation, actually constraining the system and making it more operational. So Protocol Labs has been running a lot of experiments on this. To quickly explain kind of what this looks like, these are various different experiments that we've run kind of more broadly and then focused over the last 12 months. So how I would read this is on the bottom, as you go more to the right, you're making a trade-off of the operational cost is higher. So it takes more from the people who are actually interacting with the system, who are voting. It's higher lift on them, but the system setup cost is actually lower. So the example I'll give is Filecoin. Filecoin is an impact evaluator. However, the system setup costs are extremely high. You have to basically build, design, and deploy a protocol, which takes a lot of thinking. Whereas you can do something that is more on subjective quantification, which is an experiment we ran where we get a group of experts who basically determine everything. They determine what projects were valuable. They determine within the scope of PL how much value was created, and they go and vote about how much value should be allocated against a bunch of those. The benefit of that system is it's very flexible. You can literally take a bunch of experts and say, evaluate anything, but you don't get any scale efficiencies, and it is really, really hard to do. So example is Filecoin massively powerful system, very hard to design and takes a lot of setup time. Then we look over to things like Slingshot, which is actually building on top of the core Filecoin protocol, and actually is an incentive system designed to onboard storage providers. So think of that as like an impulse function that actually we had to build infrastructure around that, and that's been kind of accelerating storage provider adoption over the last kind of 12 to 18 months, I believe. Then we have something, we did a KPI impact evaluator where we tried to quantify ecosystem activity and design systems to measure that. And that was a mixture of system design where we actually created quantifiable metrics, but also had various experts feeding us like feedback on what was important during a time period. And then, so I think the key takeaway here is that we've actually experimented with a bunch of these different things, and what we found is through these experiments, there's different ways of kind of formulating this impact evaluator problem, and you're really making a trade-off of how much time do you want to spend creating this like very intricate system that accounts for all of like the edge cases and bad actors, versus how much do you want to quickly deploy a high lift operational system that can be applied against anything. So we could do an impact evaluator about like who was the most valuable speaker today, and we would just get a voting system with a bunch of people who are evaluators, the audience, and they would evaluate based off kind of like a value system that they choose, and we could use that to give out clout or maybe give out more fun in the comments t-shirts, whatever your value function is. So I think what this has led to us to kind of think of is there's a few different archetypes and how you can design them and like where they can be applied that is, I think, super useful. So I think starting on the left, you've got this like closed quantitative protocol level impact evaluator. This is something where all the rules are set, all the impacts or the inputs and the outputs are measured, systematic, developed. This is the most powerful, but it's also the most rigid. So you can think of like, there's the Galaxy Brain. I've created the ultimate protocol and like block reward design, which creates massive value like Bitcoin. It could also turn into a paperclip making AI robot that just creates paper clips because it's been told to optimize on paper clips and reproducing as many paper clips as possible. As you move over, I think you're seeing different paradigms where it's how much of a system do you want to set up to create this impact evaluator? And then how much do you want to let experts actually provide inputs? And experts are a little bit tricky. I've used the kind of analogy of herding cats. If you let experts do whatever they want, you're going to get a lot of like really, really wide varying and not necessarily super useful feedback. Whereas you kind of have to cage the cat a little bit and give them very specific directions on what they are giving input on. So you see some things like retro PGF or some of the work that we did with like voting about like what was valuable contributions to open source software. You give them a constrained set of output or a constrained set of inputs and then feed that into your broader system. So this is all playing back and forth between like where do you actually apply these. So I would say closed quantitative protocol, that's your layer one incentive system for impact evaluators. Then you move over, I think a quantitative system that you can layer on, something like Slingshot that we did was more of an impulse function. But you have to be careful because it can warp the existing crypto economics in a way that you don't necessarily want by introducing kind of like weird incentives that cascade over time. Then we see like restricted expert systems, and I would call that like a retro PGF type where you have a specific set of projects and a specific scope, and you use that to kind of like aggregate expert input. When you scope it down so that they're only giving input on very specific things, that's the most scalable, but it's also the most restricted and rigid. So really it depends on like what is the shape of your problem that you want to apply an impact evaluator against, and then understanding the design considerations, because there's no bad, and I stole this from somebody else, but like there's no such thing as bad answer, there's just trade-offs. So it's like really kind of like the degree in which you want to make that trade-off. So I'll go into some quick takeaways and then I'll open it up because I want to get some feedback on some interesting problems we've run into. But takeaway so far has been that quantitative systems, within Web3 particularly, there's just this massive infrastructure gap for measuring ecosystems. So how do you measure an ecosystem's activity in a decentralized, objective way? Because I think we're also used to the idea like, oh, we should have metrics about everybody who's using the network, but that implies like a central measurement system, which kind of goes against some of the ethos. I think there's good work being done about how we can kind of like aggregate opinion across like decentralized networks, but that's beyond my technical knowledge for this talk. So I think that's a really important thing. So really, you see quantitative systems emerging around existing quantitative infrastructure. So how do you kind of use on-chain, which are like verifiable metrics to inform your impact evaluator and build on top of that. For expert systems, the rate limiting factor has always been expert subjective input. I see a dangerous hole that we ourselves fell into, which was whenever we didn't have a good quantitative system, we'd say, oh, we'll just get experts to vote on it. But the chances are that your experts, you have to be very careful about selecting them so that they have the right domain expertise and the right amount of bias, and mixing that group in that pool, but also understanding that we're such a small field, and a lot of the things that we're kind of evaluating impact against have such niche knowledge that the people who know this are the most time constrained, and you can get 20 minutes of their time every 6 months. I think whenever you're introducing new incentive systems, you need to account for existing forces at play. That's something we learned because we were going through the process of launching like some larger scale impact evaluators, and we had to talk to the crypto economics team that designed the Filecoin ecosystem, and they had some strong feelings that we would warp their existing system by introducing any additional incentives. I think right now we found the most success when you have impact evaluators on a very tight scope and as a component of a larger program. So we've talked about work that we're doing on blue funds, which are decentralized kind of like public goods funding efforts. And when you link grants funding, bounties, and impact evaluators together under like a very defined value capture umbrella, it actually works pretty well because you can kind of measure the kind of impact a lot better. As an isolated, and you're seeing this also with things like, I think Optimism has done a lot of great work working with the Ethereum ecosystem and being able to kind of, link that together and just have like a very specific scope among other existing things like Gitcoin. So I think one thing too is that transaction costs limit impact valuations significantly. It's really, really freaking expensive to run an impact evaluator in terms of machinery, in terms of timing, all this sort of stuff. So right now we can't run it on everything. It's like you can't do small tail reward systems, at least in my opinion. So we need to be very careful about the experiments we run. It almost necessitates a large volume of capital to kind of like supply the overhead. And this is something that like it's not just like a mechanism design. It's not just like a technical problem. It's also a behavior change, and people need to start going through the expectation of reward, and this is going to happen over time because it only works if people expect there to be a retroactive evaluation of what they did as valuable. So what we end up there is like there's kind of a cold start problem of the initial funders are going to have to understand that they're going to have a big loss at the beginning, or like more loss than their steady state, because they're going to have to build behaviors and build expectations as they go. So I'll skip this really quick. I think there's a lot of experiments going on about ecosystem scale. Open source tooling needs to improve to increase the efficiency of all this expert input. We're working on composability with other funding mechanisms to link them together in a better way. I would propose a few future directions, and this is just kind of from the perspective of Protocol Labs, but I think it's helpful to start this conversation, I think we need to develop more like quantitative impact evaluations with measurement systems. I think a lot is being done on expert systems where you have people voting on a specific scope. I think for us to have scalable mechanisms, we need to build out more kind of quantitative systems. We need to expand the tooling system suite and link for operability. There's a lot of different approaches out there. The real thing I want to focus on is like crowdsourcing experiments and coordinating within the ecosystem, because as we heard like during the HyperSearch talk, there's a lot of people who've been working on this problem in the past in various different shapes and sizes, and there's a lot of people working on this in parallel, and I think there's a lot we could learn about each other. Hopefully this is a first step about us talking very openly about the things that are working and aren't. But I think we'll try and launch something to get, if you're doing an experiment on impact evaluator, come let us know, and like we're happy to provide feedback, support, tell us where ours has worked in the past and like where we might be helpful. But I think getting the community more oriented so we're not working in silos is super helpful. And I think there's just a lot of like need for more scalable expert systems like quadratic voting or quadratic funding. So things like liquid democracy, just making more scalable use of expert time. So this is the last part, and would like to kind of open it up to the crowd here. There's a lot of kind of what I'd call existential problems, which is the stuff that keeps us up at night, that we need people smarter than ourselves to figure out. And I put some kind of directional solutions down here, but these are open problems, and like we don't have it all figured out yet. But I would start off with kind of at the top, ROI of retroactive funding and impact evaluators. I think the key here is like, how do we prove that somebody should spend $1 million on an impact evaluator instead of $1 million on a grant program? And until we see, that actually happening in practice, I think like that is, and how we solve that, I would say, is like, I think we need a little bit of development about the theory of like, how do we establish a counterfactual for impact evaluators? Like, if we spent the $1 million somewhere else in this example, what would be the impact? Would that be a better use of our time? I think some of the stuff that we can do there is like there's a lot of like good modeling that teams like block science have done, and just like building a theory out that would really help us push forward. But the deliverable there would be is like, if you have a system that can tell me that I should spend my $5 million across grants, bounties, and impact evaluators in this optimal mix, that would be huge. Particularly, the dollar spent on impact evaluators is net positive ROI. I think that would go a lot way to the scalability. The second thing is like creating an appropriate reserve pool to like reward, and like just the capital efficiency issue of impact evaluators. Especially when it's future, you need to have a pool of funding that isn't going to disappear. And especially when you start thinking of like, if we want to reward impact exponentially, which there's a discussion about whether or not that is actually needed versus like rewarding to the level of incentivization, you need to make sure that that capital is available to be retroactively rewarded, or else people won't believe enough to actually go after these problems. So, and also when it's just sitting there, it's not very capital efficient, especially if it's a depreciating asset. It's really hard to justify, oh, we're going to have a bunch of money sitting here and we're not going to do anything every year just so that it's available for this eventual retroactive reward, because we think that there's benefit there. So I think there's a couple ways we could do this. Creating aqueducts from ecosystem token pools has been effective in the past. You've seen that with like foundation models where people are creating pools of capital that think about public goods in the long term. Staking, so taking the tokens that are meant to be, or tokens in this case being the reward pool, putting that in a way that it actually generates some returns, but actually has like an ability to be retroactively funded. And then things like ecosystem taxation, redirecting gas fees towards impact evaluators. I think you could draw an analog to some of this interesting stuff that Optimism is doing with that. So that's one potential area. This is a really big one, is incentive systems for impact evaluator entities. We talk about this idea that impact evaluation is great. It's going to kind of backpropagate signal. It's going to tell us what's valuable. But why do I, as a person who is smart and as an expert, why do I spend my time evaluating impact? And like going through the process of like issuing this for third parties. So there's a couple different ways we can think about that. Is like, maybe there's a reputational staking system where that reputation of like you have actually contributed actively, similar to kind of like contributing to an open source ecosystem. There's potentially like a way of aligning incentives with like staking upside, whether that's like locally in ecosystems. That's a big problem that I would love help with. And then the last is just like, it's really costly to run any of these experiments right now, and it almost doesn't justify the amount of money that we're able to send out because impact evaluators haven't been massively scalable yet. So any tooling, methodology, and I think this is more solvable and tractable, the more we put effort into running these experiments, building the right infrastructure, the better our transaction costs will be. This is like, over time, this has been proven in pretty much any market. We just need to continually build and have the incentives there to do so. So we need help here. We're also hiring. So if anybody wants to join the network funding team and work on these kind of problems, we need startup operators, PMs, and research scientists. And do we have time? Do you have time for one question?
Yeah, 1 minute.
1 minute? All right, well, we'll open it up. Any questions, criticisms, comments?
Hi. So with retroactive evaluation of a contribution and awards being allocated at that point, how do you avoid turning off people who are contributing in good faith, but then you realize that maybe that's not the most valuable contribution? Like, I'm kind of listening through this, I'm worried about like some inherent bitterness from people who are trying to do something positive, and you're like, yeah, you don't get any money for the last 3 months.
So it's a great question, and we actually ran into this in one of the experiments we did on an open source repo. I think it requires careful calibration, and this is where it's like the fine tuning of the reward function is so important. I think and it's a mixture of like there's monetary reward and then there's kind of like reputational, and it's kind of I don't want to say good vibes reward, but like there's like a social component too. And the truth is like it's always going to be a balance. Like you're going to throw some people off, but the idea of like, can we actually incentivize like net positive impact by, introducing these incentives and like showing and signaling that we are like as a community valuing the inputs. It's really, it ends up being about the design, about like, okay, if we're doing it for a 3-month period, like we're acknowledging things beforehand, and like it's about how you set your scope. And it's just like understand the implications of every kind of design decision you make is important. And there's always going to be a factor of like, you might piss some people off, but is that net positive for the ecosystem or the project you're looking at? That's for you to decide. And like in our case, we over-calibrated rewards, and I think in retrospect, we actually went back and adjusted it, but I think we undervalued contributions from open source members earlier on and had to kind of like retrospectively say like, okay, we messed up. we didn't calibrate our rewards properly. We need input from maintainers, from the open source contribution about like what is the right way to do this. And we adjusted our reward function not to be just like monetarily or just not focused on like, for example, like a PR and a repo as like an indicator of like overall contributions to like a repo, but more broadly about like, reviewing codes, contributing to the community through comments. And it just required us to recalibrate our kind of reward function to account for that.